Echoes of ancient Hellenic tales have reached us from deep within the annals of time, across myriads of generations. These are stories that have survived millennia, passed down from mouth to mouth, like a precious legacy, carefully guarded and handed down through generations. They are narratives shrouded in an aura of mysticism and enchantment, capable of captivating anyone willing to listen to the whispers of the past. Imagine the twilight, when the day's hustle and bustle recedes, dissolving like a light mist over the serene waters of the Aegean Sea. It is in such an atmosphere that we begin our immersion into a world where Olympian gods majestically walked among mortals, and every peak and every corner of the earth held its own secret mysteries. Deep in the heart of an ancient Greek forest, where the air was fragrant with pine needles and wild herbs, and golden sunbeams pierced through the thick canopy, casting intricate patterns on the forest floor, one such tale began. This was a place mortals rarely dared to tread, a secluded sanctuary favoured by the goddess Artemis herself. She, patroness of the hunt, and protector of all things wild, was different from the other Olympian deities. While the inhabitants of Olympus indulged in lavish feasts and boisterous arguments, Artemis valued solitude above all else. Her dwelling was this quiet forest wilderness, where her only companions were her loyal hunting nymphs. One such day, as the first rays of the sun just touched the horizon, Artemis was already on the hunt. Her silver bow, a symbol of her power and skill, glinted in the light filtering through the leaves, and a pack of devoted hunting dogs silently followed her, gliding like shadows through the dense undergrowth. However, as the sun reached its zenith, the goddess was ready to set aside her hunt and indulge in a different ritual. A secret refuge awaited her, a pool hidden deep in the forest, behind a veil of weeping willow branches. The water in it, pure, fed by a pristine natural spring bubbling up from beneath the earth, was always cool and crystal clear. Its bottom was paved with smooth, polished stones, and emerald moss softly carpeted the edges of the rocks. It was a place of such untouched beauty and tranquility that even in complete solitude one would feel compelled to speak only in whispers. Pushing aside the curtain of willow branches, Artemis stepped into her sacred sanctuary. Her loyal nymph companions, who had chosen to serve the goddess in the rivers and forests, immediately began to help her shed her hunting gear. With care and reverence they unlaced her leather boots, gently removed her quiver of silver arrows, and carefully set aside her precious bow. The goddess, with a soft sigh of pleasure, sank into the cool waters. It was her favourite moment of the day, when she could cast aside the burdens of her powerful Olympian status and simply revel in the pure, unadorned pleasure of the cool water against her skin after her long morning's travels. It was at this serene moment, as the goddess indulged in her solitude, that the narrative takes a sharp, unsettling turn. Nearby, making his way through the forest thickets with far less grace than Artemis, was a young mortal hunter named Actaeon. He was renowned for his hunting skill, but alas, not for his attentiveness to his surroundings. All morning, Actaeon had been relentlessly pursuing a particularly cunning doe, following its faint tracks deeper and deeper into the woods. His loyal hunting dogs, noses to the ground, raced ahead, completely absorbed by the scent trail. However, Actaeon had no idea that with each step he was venturing further into sacred territory. This part of the forest belonged exclusively to Artemis, and entry for mortals was strictly forbidden. Of course, there were no warning signs. This was ancient Greece, not a modern nature preserve. But in the very air, there seemed to linger a tangible sense of ancient, formidable power that should have served as a warning and compelled him to turn back. Actaeon, pushing through a particularly dense thicket of bushes, heard the distinct sound of flowing water. He surmised that the doe he had been pursuing for so long might have stopped to quench its thirst. His dogs, who had been running ahead, suddenly fell silent, which for an experienced hunter was always a sure sign of approaching prey. And then, quite unexpectedly, he found himself at the very edge of Artemis's secret pool. In that instant, time seemed to freeze, halting its course. The goddess stood before him, immersed in the water, surrounded by her nymphs, and her gaze, fixed on the intruder, was filled with pure shock. Her silver eyes first widened in astonishment, then narrowed dangerously, portending something ominous. A reasonable observer might assume that in such a situation a mortal hunter would immediately offer apologies and hasten away. That would have been the logical and prudent course of action. However, Actaeon remained standing, unable to avert his gaze. Perhaps he was so stunned by what he saw that he couldn't move. Perhaps the sight of a true goddess, appearing in all her pristine beauty, had mesmerized him. Or perhaps he simply couldn't fully comprehend the reality of what was unfolding. Artemis's nymphs cried out in astonishment and rushed to shield their mistress from his immodest gaze. But it was too late. Actaeon had already seen what no mortal was ever meant to behold. And Artemis, goddess of the hunt and unyielding guardian of her privacy, was consumed by an absolute incandescent rage. However, gods, unlike mortals, rarely confined themselves to mere shouts when expressing their wrath. They preferred elaborate, sometimes monstrous punishments, and Artemis, in this regard, was particularly inventive when it came to trespassers on her sacred solitude. She reached out and scooped up a handful of the cool spring water, but as the water touched her palms it began to glow with an unearthly, divine luminescence. Without a word, with icy calm, the goddess flung this enchanted water directly into Actaeon's face. The droplets, like splashes of liquid starlight, struck him. For a moment, Actaeon felt only coolness on his skin. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to feel strange, frightening changes. It began with his reflection in the pool. Instead of his own human face, he saw something else staring back at him. His nose elongated, darkened. His ears grew and changed shape, moving to the top of his head. And most terrifying of all, antlers, real, branching antlers, began to sprout from his skull. Actaeon tried to scream, tried to beg for forgiveness, tried to explain that his intrusion was accidental. But when he opened his mouth, instead of human words, only the frightened bleating of a deer escaped him. His hands, when he looked at them, were no longer hands at all. They had transformed into hooves. His clothes hung loosely on his rapidly changing body, which was shrinking and transforming. Human thoughts still raced within his mind, trapped inside, but his body now belonged entirely to a magnificent, yet doomed, stag. At that moment, stunned by the horror of his new existence, Actaeon heard a sound that made his newly acquired deer heart pound in a panicked rhythm. It was barking, the barking of his own hunting dogs who, drawn by the commotion of the transformation, had rushed to the scene. But they did not see their master, Actaeon. Before them stood only a large stag, not far from their favourite hunting ground, and following their instincts, they acted as hunting dogs were trained to do. Actaeon desperately tried to call out to them, tried to make them understand who he truly was. But deer do not speak the language of dogs, and his once loyal companions saw only prey where their beloved master had just been. What followed was perhaps the most tragic part of this ancient story. Actaeon, still thinking as a man but trapped in the body of a stag, was forced to flee for his life from his own once beloved hunting pack. He raced through the forest, leaping over fallen logs, dodging trees, while behind him, with the same relentless enthusiasm they displayed on their joint hunts, his dogs pursued. He ran until his new deer legs trembled with exhaustion. He sought refuge behind rocks and in dense bushes, but in the end, as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, his own hounds caught him. Meanwhile, at the secret pool, Artemis completed her ablutions and once again donned her hunting attire. Her nymphs, still agitated by what had transpired, gathered around her, quietly discussing the unusual mortal who had so rashly trespassed into their sacred refuge. "Did your punishment truly have to be so severe?" one of the nymphs timidly asked, her voice barely a whisper. He seemed so young. Perhaps he was merely lost, unaware of the sanctity of this place. Artemis, raising her silver bow, tested the string with a light touch of her finger, and a soft, melodic sound echoed through the quiet forest. "Solitude is sacred," she stated with unwavering firmness. "Mortals must learn that some boundaries are never to be crossed, even by accident." She paused for a moment, listening to distant sounds emanating from deeper within the forest. Somewhere far off, she discerned the triumphant barking of dogs. She knew what that meant. "Besides," she added, and perhaps there was a faint, almost imperceptible softening in her voice, "he was a hunter. He understood perfectly the relationship between predator and prey. Now he has experienced both sides of that relationship, knowing it to its fullest." As the night's gloom began to descend upon the forest, Artemis and her companions silently dissolved into the shadows between the trees, leaving behind only the soothing sound of the bubbling spring and the whisper of the wind in the willow branches. However, this story leaves behind profound reflections. Was Artemis merely a protector of her privacy, or was there a deeper meaning hidden behind her actions? In the ancient world, there was a belief that gods sometimes used harsh lessons to convey important truths to mortals about respect, the inviolability of boundaries, and the inevitability of consequences for every choice. And what about Actaeon himself? Some versions of the myth hint that he was not entirely innocent, suggesting that he might have intentionally sought out the goddess, driven by an audacious desire to see her. Others assert that he was merely a lost hunter, finding himself in the wrong place at the wrong time by an unfortunate accident. The question of the justice of Artemis's punishment remains open. Was it proportionate to the transgression, or was it excessively cruel for what might have been an innocent mistake? And how would a person act, finding themselves in Actaeon's shoes? Would they hasten away, realizing that something forbidden lay before them, or would they remain standing, paralyzed by reverent terror? This dilemma of just retribution naturally leads to even darker pages of mythology, to a narrative of all-consuming fear and the terrifying deeds those who fear losing their power are capable of. If Artemis's actions seem severe, then the story of Cronus and his relationship with his own children will undoubtedly surpass the listener's wildest expectations. Let us delve into the depths of time, to the dawn of creation, as the ancient Hellenes envisioned it. This was an era preceding the reign of Zeus from the summit of Olympus, the emergence of majestic temples or the first human settlements, and even the very genesis of humankind. In those primordial times, the cosmos was ruled unchallenged by powerful beings known as the Titans, colossal, incomparably strong entities who were the direct offspring and grandchildren of Gaia herself, Mother Earth. And among all these Titans, Cronus was the supreme ruler. His ascent to the throne was not the result of democratic will or a peaceful transfer of power. On the contrary, he seized the throne by committing a horrifying act against his own father, Uranus, using a curved blade his mother had given him. Cronus mercilessly attacked Uranus and overthrew him in a brutal coup that shook the very foundations of existence. One might assume that the triumphant overthrow of his own parent would instill in Cronus a sense of absolute confidence in the unshakable nature of his power. However, reality proved otherwise. Daily he was tormented by agonizing thoughts that a similar fate might befall him. Each passing night he succumbed to anxious deliberations, wondering if any of his offspring was secretly plotting against him, just as he himself had once plotted against Uranus. And then one day Cronus was granted a prophecy that made even his darkest premonitions pale in comparison. This prediction was uttered by the fates themselves, 3 ancient sisters whose vision pierced through the veil of time, discerning the finest threads of destiny stretching into the future. Their message was succinct, yet terrifying, and utterly indisputable. One of your children will overthrow you, just as you overthrew your father. Under normal circumstances, faced with unsettling predictions about the future, most mortals would likely attempt to alter their course of action, striving to prevent the undesirable outcome. Perhaps they would endeavor to become more nurturing parents or raise their offspring with greater tenderness and less fear. Cronus, however, unfortunately chose a far more direct and brutal path. His reasoning was simple. If he had no children, then none could ever overthrow him. But there was one unforeseen complication. Cronus was already married to his sister Rhea. Yes, marriages between blood relatives were, apparently, a common occurrence among the Titans of that era, and she was already carrying their firstborn. Thus, Cronus devised a plan that was both monstrously simple and utterly chilling. He would allow the children to be born and then simply devour them. Imagine the moment when their first offspring, a daughter named Hestia, was born. Rhea, exhausted from a long labor but radiant with maternal joy, gently held her infant to her breast and smiled at that tiny, perfect face. Likely her thoughts were filled with visions of all the wonderful knowledge she would share with her daughter, all the marvelous places they would visit together, all the boundless love they would share. At that moment, Cronus entered the chambers. "Give me the child," he commanded in his deep, resonant, thunder-like Titan voice. Rhea must have assumed he wished to hold the newborn, to welcome her into the world with a father's blessing. Instead, Cronus took the infant into his colossal hands, opened his maw impossibly wide, and swallowed little Hestia in one horrifying gulp. Can one fathom the depth of Rhea's despair and horror? Can one imagine her piercing scream? Her desperate, futile attempts to stop him, her complete inability to comprehend why her husband had committed such a monstrous act. But Cronus merely wiped his lips nonchalantly and departed, satisfied that he had eliminated at least one potential threat to his unchallenged dominion. Truly, the most heartbreaking detail of this tragedy was not a single fit of madness. With the birth of their second child, a daughter named Demeter, the story repeated itself with horrifying precision. Cronus once again took the infant and devoured her whole. Then came Hera, their third offspring, and she met the same dismal fate. Soon Hades, their first son, appeared, who also vanished without a trace in a single gulp. Poseidon, their second son, followed. Another gulp, and another child dissolved within his father's belly. Perhaps a question arises. What happened to these children after Cronus swallowed them? Did they die? The answer to that question is both disturbing and, paradoxically, comforting, for Cronus was an immortal Titan. His offspring were also immortal. Therefore, when he swallowed them, they did not perish. Instead, they found themselves captives within his stomach, alive but imprisoned in impenetrable eternal darkness. Imagine yourself as one of these unfortunate children. You are aware of your existence. You vaguely sense the presence of your siblings around you in the dark, yet you cannot escape. You cannot grow. You cannot experience the world. You can do nothing but languish in the warm, confined belly of your own father. Meanwhile, Rhea, with each lost child, plunged into deeper despair and inconsolable grief. She pleaded with Cronus to cease his monstrous actions. She attempted to hide whenever labor pains began. She appealed to the other Titans for help, but Cronus was the unchallenged ruler, and the fear of him was so immense that no one dared to intervene. By the time Rhea was pregnant with her sixth child, she realized she had to act differently. She could no longer bear to lose another of her offspring to her husband's paranoid greed. So she devised a plan that was both ingenious and incredibly risky. When the time came for the birth of her sixth child, Rhea did not return to their palace. Instead, she journeyed to a distant, secluded refuge, a cave on the island of Crete. There, surrounded by benevolent nymphs who helped muffle the sounds of childbirth, she gave birth to a sane, whom she named Zeus. But instead of taking the newborn Zeus to his father, Rhea cleverly wrapped a large stone in infant swaddling clothes. She carefully ensured that the stone matched the approximate size and weight of an infant. She even put a tiny cap on it so that from a distance it would appear to be a real baby. Then she returned home and presented this false infant to Cronus. One might assume that a father would be able to distinguish a living infant from a mere stone wrapped in cloth. However, it must be remembered, Cronus had no desire to be a father at all. His mind was so consumed with the idea of eliminating any potential threat to his omnipotence that he never bothered to truly look at his children before devouring them. So, when Rhea handed him the bundle, Cronus accepted it without much scrutiny and swallowed the stone whole, just as he had done with his 5 previous offspring. Meanwhile, the infant Zeus remained safely hidden in the cave on Crete, where he was lovingly raised by nymphs, nourished with honey and the milk of a wondrous goat named Amalthea. With each passing day he grew stronger and larger, and daily Rhea secretly visited him, recounting stories of his siblings, imprisoned within their father's belly. As Zeus grew from an infant into a young man, he grasped the depth of his father's terrifying fear, and learned of the monstrous deeds that fear had driven him to commit. And then Zeus began to slowly hatch his plan of retribution. However, it is the next aspect that lends this ancient tale particular intrigue. Zeus was not merely content with punishing his father for his unthinkable cruelty. His plan also encompassed the rescue of his siblings. Unlike Cronus, who viewed his offspring solely as potential threats to his position, Zeus saw them as members of his family, deserving of freedom. The question that plagued Zeus in his deliberations was this: was he destined to repeat his father's fate? Would the overthrow of Cronus turn him into another ruthless ruler, doomed one day to fear and destroy his own children? Or would he manage to break the vicious cycle of violence that had passed from Uranus to Cronus and now threatened to continue with him? What, in the author's opinion, compels a person to see enemies in their own children? Is it merely the fear of losing power? Or is there something deeper at play? Perhaps some fundamental inability to love others more than one's own security. Reflecting on cycles of violence and their sometimes unexpected consequences, the next chapter of our narrative begins with one of the most beautiful possible outcomes, one that paradoxically arose from one of the most brutal acts in all of mythology. Sometimes it seems the ancient Greeks, through their myths, convey a thought to us. Even the most monstrous events can give birth to something wondrous. Let us recall the moment when Cronus overthrew his father Uranus, using a curved blade. Ancient storytellers held very specific beliefs about what followed this act of unthinkable brutality. They believed that when Uranus was wounded, drops of his immortal blood fell into the boundless sea. And it was from this divine substance, mingled with sea foam and the ocean's salty water, that something truly miraculous began to take shape. Imagine this picturesque scene. The Mediterranean Sea appears so serene on this morning that its surface seems like a polished mirror, reflecting the heavens. The sun is just beginning its ascent, painting the sky in soft gradients of pink and gold. Gentle waves softly lap against the shore, bringing with them the ocean's usual gifts: fragments of smooth sea glass, intricate seashells, tangled strands of seaweed. However, on this unique morning, the waves carried something utterly unprecedented. At first, this phenomenon resembled ordinary sea foam, a white, bubbling mass that forms as waves break against coastal rocks. But this foam was different. It emanated a soft, pearlescent glow. It did not dissipate like any other foam. On the contrary, it grew in size and became increasingly luminous as it drifted towards the shore. And then, slowly, with astonishing grace, a figure began to rise from this glowing substance. It was Aphrodite, the great goddess of love and beauty, emerging from the very heart of the sea. The ancient Hellenes held very specific notions of what the embodiment of perfect beauty should be. Aphrodite was not merely beautiful. She was beauty itself, materialized in a living being. Her hair caught the rays of the morning sun as if woven from pure gold. Her skin possessed the flawless smoothness of mother of pearl. Her eyes shimmered with the hues of the deep ocean on a summer afternoon. But beyond her physical splendor, there was something in Aphrodite's presence that transformed everything around her, making it more beautiful. The sea foam streaming around her sparkled like a scattering of diamonds. Ordinary seashells at her feet suddenly took on the appearance of precious gems. Even the seagulls, soaring in the sky, seemed to fly with greater grace and elegance when she was near. When Aphrodite, the goddess of love, first touched land, her steps left behind not just imprints, but entire fields of blossoming flowers. These were no ordinary flowers, but magnificent roses whose beauty and fragrance surpassed anything humanity had ever seen. It seemed the earth itself rejoiced at her arrival. However, one aspect of this divine birth was particularly noteworthy. Aphrodite emerged fully grown, possessing complete self-awareness and understanding of her essence and power. Unlike mortal infants who face a long journey of discovery, she instantly recognized her divine nature, and that her domain encompassed all manifestations of love. And this love, as Aphrodite soon discovered, was far more multifaceted and complex than merely bestowing happiness. The first thing that captured her attention was the profound influence of her presence on the surrounding creatures. A pair of dolphins peacefully gliding near the shore suddenly began to perform an intricate courtship dance, gracefully leaping and circling in the water. Two seagulls, previously fiercely fighting over prey, suddenly forgot their animosity and began to gently preen each other's feathers. Even the plant kingdom reacted to her unseen influence. Vines, growing in opposite directions, unexpectedly intertwined, forming living patterns. Trees that stood apart began to lean towards their neighbors, as if seeking communication and closeness. But Aphrodite also sensed something else, a pervasive sense of loneliness permeating the world. In the boundless ocean expanses behind her, she felt the isolation of creatures swimming alone in the deep waters. On the land stretching before her, she sensed animals and spirits who had never known the true comfort of companionship. And most surprisingly, she could feel the emotions of her fellow gods, though she had never met them. Somewhere in the distance, she sensed Zeus's complex array of feelings related to his power and responsibility. She felt Hera's internal struggle between love and jealousy. She even sensed the loneliness of Artemis, who had consciously chosen solitude, yet sometimes wondered what she was truly missing. It was at that moment that Aphrodite made a fateful decision that would impact both gods and mortals for many centuries to come. She decided that her role would be not merely to embody love, but to actively create the conditions for its flourishing. She began small, with the creatures surrounding her. She inspired dolphins to seek out companions. She helped solitary seabirds find mates. She even influenced ocean currents to bring together fish swimming alone. But as she walked along the shore, exploring this new world into which she had been born, Aphrodite began to understand that love was not always a simple blessing. She observed a pair of crabs fiercely fighting over territory, and realized that sometimes the desire to protect what one loves can lead to conflict. She saw a mother bird aggressively chasing away other feathered creatures approaching her nest, and understood that love often involved possessiveness and jealousy. Most strikingly, she discovered that her very presence could cause problems. As she passed a group of young dolphins, they all immediately fell in love with her, abandoning their previous affections and following her along the shore. She had to learn to control her influence, to use it thoughtfully, rather than allowing it to indiscriminately affect everyone around her. This was Aphrodite's first lesson in understanding the responsibility inextricably linked to her divine powers. To be the goddess of love did not simply mean making everyone fall in love with each other. It entailed a profound understanding of the delicate balance between desire and respect, between passion and wisdom, between bringing people together and allowing them the freedom to choose their own paths. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Aphrodite realized she would need to find her place among the other gods. She had been born with the knowledge of other immortal beings like herself, possessing their own domains and unique personalities. But she also understood that her arrival would alter the dynamics of their relationships in ways no one could predict. After all, What happens when the goddess of love appears in a family that already has its share of complicated interrelationships? What happens when someone with the power to influence emotions joins a group of powerful beings who don't always manage their own feelings well? Aphrodite stood at the water's edge, gazing at the boundless sea that had given her birth, then turned to survey the land where a new life awaited her. The wind played with her golden locks, and roses continued to bloom profusely at her feet. She was the embodiment of beauty, power, and immortality. But in some ways she was utterly alone. She was one of a kind, the only being whose very essence was love. How does one build genuine relationships when your presence automatically influences what others feel towards you? How do you know if someone genuinely cares for you, or if it's merely a reaction to your divine nature? These were the questions Aphrodite carried with her as she took her first steps from the sea towards Mount Olympus, where the other gods unknowingly awaited the arrival of embodied love. And perhaps these are questions we still grapple with today. How do we balance the desire to be loved with the need to be authentic? How do we know when our feelings for someone are genuine and when they are merely a reaction to superficial attractions? How do we love others while maintaining our own identity? Questions of identity and authenticity lead us to one of the most terrifying trials Zeus ever faced, a battle that tested not only his strength, but his very right to rule the cosmos. Because sometimes the greatest threats come not from familial betrayal or romantic complications, but from forces of pure chaotic destruction. By this time, Zeus had successfully overthrown his father, Cronus, freed his siblings from imprisonment within their father's stomach, and established himself as king of the gods on Mount Olympus. One might think this would be a fitting time for Zeus to relax and enjoy his victory. Instead, it was then that Earth herself decided to test whether Zeus truly deserved his throne. You see, Gaia, the personification of Earth, had watched her children and grandchildren fight each other for generations. First, Uranus had been cruel to his offspring. Then Cronus had brutally overthrown Uranus. Now Zeus had overthrown Cronus with similar ruthlessness. Gaia was weary of this endless familial violence, and she was particularly incensed that Zeus had imprisoned many of her other children, the Titans, in the deepest and darkest abyss of the underworld. So Gaia decided to create a champion who could defeat Zeus once and for all, not to rule in his place, but to end the cycle of brutal power struggles by utterly destroying the very concept of divine kingship. She retreated to the deepest caverns beneath the earth, where the rock was still molten and the air shimmered with unbearable heat. There, in a cave lit only by the gleam of subterranean lava flows, Gaia embarked on her most ambitious creation. She gathered clay from the deepest ocean trenches, mixed it with fire from the earth's core, and breathed into it all her fury, her frustration, and her burning desire to end divine tyranny. What emerged from this process was something that had never existed before, and hopefully never would again. His name was Typhon, and he was designed to be the ultimate anti-god. Imagine the most enormous mountain you have ever seen, and then imagine it could move, think, and hate. Typhon was so tall that, when he stood upright, his head scraped the stars. His eyes burned like miniature suns. Instead of hair, his head was covered with writhing snakes. Each one was venomous enough to kill 100 mortals with a single bite. But perhaps most terrifying were his arms. From his elbows down, instead of normal limbs, Typhon had 100 dragon heads. Each head could spew forth different kinds of destruction, Some belched fire, others noxious gas, still others an icy wind capable of freezing. Living beings, solid in seconds. When Typhon first emerged from the earth, his mere standing up caused earthquakes across the known world. His roar, which came not only from his mouth, but from all 100 of his dragon-head arms, was so deafening that it shattered mountains and triggered avalanches for thousands of miles. When the gods on Mount Olympus first saw Typhon approaching, their reaction was not to stand and fight. It was to flee as quickly as possible, and we are talking about the very gods who had successfully fought the Titans, who commanded lightning and earthquakes, and the underworld itself. But Typhon was something else entirely. He was not just powerful, he was chaos personified, destruction for its own sake, the end of everything they had built. One by one the Olympian gods fled to Egypt, where they disguised themselves as animals to hide from Typhon's searching gaze. Aphrodite became a fish, Apollo transformed into a raven, Artemis became a cat, even mighty. Ares, the god of war, turned into a wild boar and hid in the furthest reaches of the Nile Delta. But Zeus, alone among the gods, did not flee. Not because he wasn't afraid. The stories clearly show that Zeus was terrified of Typhon, but because he understood something the other gods did not. If he fled this battle, if he allowed Typhon to destroy Mount Olympus and everything they had built, then Gaia would achieve her goal. The age of the gods would end, and the world would revert to primordial chaos. So Zeus stood alone on the highest peak of Mount Olympus, his lightning crackling in his hands, and awaited Typhon's arrival. The conflict that erupted between these titans surpassed anything the universe had ever witnessed. Zeus, the supreme god, unleashed one lightning bolt after another upon Typhon. Each of these celestial phenomena flashed with such intensity that it could blind any mortal, and thundered so deafeningly that its echo reverberated across the world. Typhon, however, seemed almost impervious. While the electrical discharges left charred marks on his rock-like skin, they did not diminish his onslaught in the slightest. At the same time, Typhon's 100 dragon heads spewed forth torrents of all manner of destructive elements upon Zeus, flames capable of melting even the strongest bronze, venom that withered vegetation for miles around, and ice so piercing that it froze the very atmospheric air. Within the first moments of the duel, Zeus had to employ all his lightning speed and unparalleled agility to avoid certain destruction. The struggle raged for days, and then weeks. The incessant roar of Zeus's lightning combined with the furious bellowing of Typhon's heads generated storms so powerful they submerged entire regions. The heat emanating from their titanic clash melted the snowcaps on the most distant mountain peaks. The earth's surface cracked and split under the impact of their crushing blows. However, it gradually dawned on Zeus that brute force alone would not secure victory in this confrontation. Typhon was simply too powerful, too invulnerable, too saturated with destructive energy. Whenever Zeus believed he had gained an advantage, Typhon would immediately unleash some new, unexpected form of attack, forcing Zeus to retreat. It was at that moment that Zeus recalled an ancient teaching given to him by his grandmother Gaia many centuries ago, long before they became adversaries. She had said that the earth itself was not only an inexhaustible source of power, but could also be turned against those who sought destruction rather than preservation. Thus, instead of trying to annihilate Typhon directly, Zeus chose a completely different path. He began to use his lightning not as weapons of destruction, but rather as tools. He aimed his strikes at the ground around Typhon, not seeking to directly harm the monster, but instead triggering massive rockfalls and landslides. At first, this method seemed utterly useless. Typhon easily forced his way through the tumbling rocks, as if they were nothing more than pebbles. But Zeus persistently continued his strikes, continued to trigger landslides, continued to pile stone upon stone, and gradually, extremely slowly, debris began to accumulate around Typhon's limbs. It took Zeus another full week of relentless lightning strikes, but eventually he managed to completely bury Typhon up to his waist in loose rock and debris. The monster still struggled desperately, continuing to spew destructive torrents from its dragon heads, but its ability to move was entirely lost. It was then that Zeus committed to his final, desperate maneuver. Instead of trying to destroy Typhon, which might have remained an impossible task, Zeus used his power over earthquakes to cause the Earth's crust to split open directly beneath the buried monster. Then, with a lightning strike surpassing in power anything he had ever summoned before, he brought an entire mountain crashing down upon Typhon. The mountain that collapsed upon Typhon was named Etna, and as the ancient Greek tales recount, Typhon remains imprisoned beneath it to this day. Every time that volcano erupts, the ancients said, it is because Typhon is still there, still filled with rage, still spewing flames and desperately trying to break free. However, the most remarkable aspect of this legend is this. Zeus achieved victory not through superior physical strength over Typhon, but through his strategic thinking and wisdom. He succeeded by employing patience instead of raw power, by thinking strategically, instead of merely fighting harder. When the other gods finally returned from Egypt and found Zeus standing, exhausted but triumphant, on the ravaged battlefield, they questioned him on how he had managed to overcome the being that had terrified them all. Zeus's answer was succinct and profound. I defeated him not because I was more powerful. I defeated him by remembering what I was fighting for. And perhaps this is a lesson that resonates not only in the depths of ancient mythology. At times, the grandest challenges in our lives cannot be overcome by simply increasing effort or escalating power. Sometimes they require us to step back, reflect deeply, and re-realize what truly matters to us. It is this concept, remembering what we fight for, that leads us to the story of one of the most celebrated heroes in all of Greek mythology, and to a narrative of how sometimes the most significant battles are fought not against the monsters themselves, but against the systems that give rise to those monsters in the first place. Now, let us transport ourselves from the majestic realm of the gods to the world of mortals, to the picturesque island of Crete, where King Minos reigned, known for his wisdom, immense wealth, and a terrifying secret hidden deep beneath his palace. This secret bore the name of the Labyrinth, and it was the most intricate and complex maze ever constructed. Crafted by the ingenious master artisan Daedalus, it was a vast subterranean network of corridors, countless dead ends and deceptive passages, so convoluted that anyone who dared to step inside would inevitably and hopelessly become lost within its depths in mere minutes. And in the very heart of this labyrinth dwelled a creature that seemed never meant to have been born, a being called the Minotaur. the story of the Minotaur itself unfolded as a profound tragedy, born of divine retribution and fatal human actions. King Minos had once incurred the wrath of the mighty god Poseidon, and the Sea Lord's vengeance took the form of a terrible curse that afflicted Minos' wife, causing her to fall passionately in love with a sacred bull. As a result of this unnatural union, a creature named the Minotaur was born, a being with the body of a mighty man but the head of a bull, endowed with human reason yet driven by an insatiable bestial hunger. King Minos, consumed by shame and horror at the sight of this living reminder of the curse that had befallen his family, commissioned Daedalus to construct the labyrinth, which was to become an eternal prison for the monster. The Minotaur could never escape, but also could never die, never find peace, remaining merely a monster doomed to exist in endless darkness. However, it is at this point that the narrative acquires an even deeper tragic dimension. To sustain the Minotaur, King Minos imposed a monstrous tribute upon the prosperous city of Athens. Every 7 years, the Athenians were obligated to send 7 youths and 7 maidens to Crete, where they were mercilessly cast into the labyrinth, doomed to be hunted and devoured by the Minotaur. Just try to imagine what this meant for the Athenian families. Every 7 years, 14 families lost their children, condemned to this terrible fate. The victims were chosen by lot, meaning every family with young people lived in constant dread that their son or daughter might be the next chosen by fate. It was into this desperate situation that our celebrated hero, Theseus, stepped. Theseus, though heir to the Athenian king Aegeus, spent his early years far from the royal halls, raised by his mother in a humble coastal settlement. He had only recently arrived in Athens, where he realized his royal lineage. Consequently, when the time came for the 3rd tribute to be sent to Crete, Theseus witnessed this heartbreaking tragedy first-hand for the first time. He watched as 14 young Athenians were chosen by lot. He saw the tears of their families, felt the deep despair in the eyes of the condemned themselves. He listened to the explanations of the elder citizens, who insisted that it was simply the way things were, that it was senseless to resist the will of King Minos and his monster. But Theseus, being young and not yet broken by years of resignation to the unacceptable, asked a direct and perceptive question: why don't we simply refuse this tribute? The answer, as he learned, was that King Minos' fleet possessed overwhelming power. If Athens dared to cease paying the tribute, Minos would immediately invade and utterly devastate the city. Thus, it was believed better to sacrifice 14 young lives every 7 years than to risk the complete annihilation of the entire populace. Such logic was entirely unacceptable to Theseus. Instead of accepting it, he made a declaration that shocked everyone present, including his own father. He voluntarily offered himself as one of the 14 tributes and swore to kill the Minotaur. King Aegeus was gripped by horror. He had only just rediscovered his son, and now Theseus intended to throw his life away on what seemed an utterly impossible mission. Dozens of young people had already been sent into the labyrinth over the years, and not one had ever returned. Many of them had been seasoned warriors. What made Theseus believe he could succeed where they had all failed? Theseus's answer revealed something essential about his character. He declared, "I may not be able to kill the Minotaur, but I can ensure I will be the last one to die trying." You see, Theseus had a meticulously thought-out plan that went far beyond simply confronting the monster. He diligently researched everything known about the labyrinth, conversing with Daedalus's former apprentices, gathering information about its construction and internal workings. He concluded that the real problem was not so much killing the Minotaur, but finding a way out of the labyrinth after accomplishing that feat. Therefore, when the ship carrying the 14 tributes arrived in Crete, Theseus carried with him not only weapons, but also a ball of thread. However, before we delve into the account of the famous thread trick, another facet of this story, often overlooked, must be mentioned. While Theseus prepared for his fateful confrontation with the Minotaur, he attracted the attention of a most unexpected person, Ariadne, the daughter of King Minos himself. Ariadne had grown up well aware of the Minotaur's existence, of the terrible tribute, and of the young people who vanished without a trace into the labyrinth every 7 years. But until now, she had never personally met any of the victims. They were always kept separate from the royal family, treated more like sacrificial animals than human beings. Meeting Theseus fundamentally changed this situation. For the first time, she was face to face with someone who was about to die to feed her family's monster. And unlike all his predecessors, Theseus was not resigned to his fate. He planned to actively resist. This circumstance created a profound moral crisis for Ariadne. She possessed the means to save Theseus's life by helping him navigate the labyrinth. But such an act would mean betraying her own father and potentially doom her own family if Minos discovered her treachery. Ultimately, Ariadne made a decision that became a cornerstone of her future destiny. She came to believe that some systems were too cruelly unjust to be allowed to persist, even if fighting them threatened the loss of the familiar world and everything she held dear. Under the cover of night, on the eve of the day Theseus was to enter the labyrinth, Ariadne secretly slipped into his cell. She brought him something Daedalus himself had given her, a wondrous ball of guiding thread that would always lead the way back to the starting point, no matter how deep its tangled passages led him. "One end must be fastened at the entrance," she whispered. "Unwind it as you proceed deeper into the labyrinth. After you have vanquished the monster, you can follow this thread back to safety." But she also bestowed upon him something even more valuable, a deep understanding of the Minotaur's habits and peculiarities, knowledge accessible only to one who had spent a lifetime within the palace walls. This creature possessed formidable strength during daylight hours, but in the darkness of night, its movements became slow and sluggish. Nearly blind, it nevertheless possessed a phenomenal sense of smell. Its mind was cunning enough to set treacherous traps, yet its pride compelled it to eschew any strategy, preferring direct challenges and brute force. The next morning, Theseus entered the labyrinth, carrying not only Ariadne's guiding thread and her invaluable knowledge, but also the burden of hope for all who had ever lost loved ones to the merciless system established by King Minos. The treacherous labyrinth proved even more convoluted and disorienting than he could have imagined. Its walls were riddled with deceptive openings and symbols designed to mislead. Corridors twisted, branched into countless pathways, and looped back on themselves, defying all logic and common sense. Even with the thread guaranteeing his return, Theseus felt himself losing his sense of direction. However, he steadily pressed deeper into the labyrinth, guided by the faint sound of the Minotaur's breathing and the increasingly distinct, pervasive scent of old bones and ingrained fear. When he finally reached the very heart of the labyrinth, Theseus found himself in a circular chamber where a single thin beam of sunlight pierced through from above. And there, upon a heap of human bones, the Minotaur slept, Its size was more modest than Theseus had anticipated, yet at the same time it possessed more humanity than expected. The creature's body was like that of a powerful warrior, scarred from countless battles, yet surprisingly graceful in its movements. Only its head remained truly monstrous, a massive bull's head with horns so sharp they could pierce even bronze armor. For a fraction of a second, doubt gripped Theseus. Before him stood not merely a ferocious monster, but a tragic victim of circumstance, a creature that had never chosen its monstrous fate, doomed to eternal confinement in darkness and to feed on innocent victims. But then, images of all the youths and maidens who had perished in that chamber flooded his memory, and he realized. To show mercy to the Minotaur meant to condemn countless future innocents to death. The battle itself, though shorter than one might have expected, was no less arduous for it. The Minotaur fought with the desperation of a cornered beast, too long languishing in captivity. But Theseus met him with the resolve of one who carried on his shoulders the hopes of everyone who had ever been sacrificed to uphold an unjust system. Once the final blow was struck, Theseus, guided by Ariadne's thread, navigated the winding passages, returning to the labyrinth's entrance. Behind him followed the remaining 13 Athenian tributes, who had waited at the entrance, barely daring to believe in the possibility of salvation. However, the narrative of Theseus does not end with his triumphant escape from Crete, for the destruction of the monster was merely a prologue to the transformation of the system that had originally spawned that monster. And in this perhaps lies the deepest lesson of this ancient legend. True courage is sometimes found not in slaying a monster, but in undertaking the long and arduous work of building a world where such monsters simply cease to be necessary. Imagine for a moment the most unusual headache ever known in the annals of creation. One morning it seemed as if Zeus's head was about to split apart. However, for Zeus, the all-powerful king of the gods, ordinary ailments were uncharacteristic. On Mount Olympus, this day began, seemingly, like many others. Helios, the sun god, was just beginning his daily journey across the azure sky, illuminating the marble columns of the majestic palace with a soft golden glow. Zeus, pacing the vast halls of his abode, pressed one hand firmly to his forehead, trying to comprehend this strange sensation that grew more unbearable with each passing day. The fact was, several months before these events, Zeus had been struck by an ominous prophecy. The Fates, those ancient sisters who tirelessly weave the threads of destiny, had whispered something to him that made even the mighty thunder god freeze in alarm.